Hey everybody, welcome to InPsightRadio. I'm your host, Danielle Egnew, and you are a fly on the wall to everywhere. How are you? I hope that your life is bringing you everything that's fabulous. I hope you're working through all the weirdness of our time frame that we're all having the opportunity to get through. And so far, at the beginning of 2020, we've got quite a road show, don't we? I mean, there's so many things going on right now. People are still working to recover economically from COVID, and some people just haven't. So that's a real thing that we're dealing with. And I'm so excited to be able to be here with you today to begin to put some focus as our new world is evolving and it's coming into what it is, to just shift a little bit of that focus to the old world. Because, you know, as a song I wrote once said, you got to go back the way that you came sometimes to learn about where you came from in order to learn about where you're going, right? And I think a lot of times in our hyper masculinated, imbalanced portion of the patriarchal, which has nothing to do with the divine masculine. The divine masculine rocks, okay? The patriarchal would be the same as like the hyper Avon feminine of the 50s. Like it's just an imbalanced modality. It's not even an energy. It's a way of being. So the energies are the divine masculine and the divine feminine. And as we look back into who we've been, I tell you that the narcissistic elements in the American consumerist culture do not really ask us to evaluate our past. They demand that we create a demigod in the present, and then have everybody worship that being. So it's a little awkward, right? When we go to talk about going and looking in the past so that we can go forward and learn in the present. And one of the things that I noticed that we really gloss over, which I think is so interesting, we gloss the hell over this like mad in our modern culture, are these stories that were so persistent for hundreds, if not thousands of years in other cultures, of great big gods that dwelled on the earth. Now, there was this weird movement, and I'm going to keep this really short at the beginning of the podcast just to lay down the premise of why I'm talking about this. This could be a podcast all in and of itself. When we went into that executive function, that prefrontal cortex function of the brain, to begin to bust out, if you will, this whole modality of thought that had to make sense out of everything and control everything. And it was such like an 1800s Victorian Gilded era, use your logic. We're going to go with the mind and not the instinctual animals pissing a circle around all that is ours. You know, we went a little imbalanced in that direction, and we began to completely discount the old stories and the old gods. And in part, that was because we had walked away as a civilization, as a humanity in general, in the Western world, as the industrialized revolution kicked in. We were really beginning to see ourselves as little mini gods, which could create anything that we wanted. You know, we could make widgets on an assembly line. We could make money appear out of thin air. We were conquering this new continent called North America that was all about the Western expansion of the United States. I mean, it was acquisition, and power and invention. And in that, it was my observation and looking at history anyway. I mean, I was going to say I wasn't there. I was probably there in some past life that I'm not remembering right now. Yeah, when we think about that time frame, it's fascinating that one of the things that was so stomped out and crushed into the ground, and really, especially in the United States and the newly formed United States that was expanding and eating the rest of the continent in its avarice, poor native inhabitants were dealing with these smelly, weird, lice-ridden, stinky white people in their clunky wagons coming across with their poorly made shotguns, blowing a hole in the heads of their family members who had lived on this land for millennia. But here comes the lice-ridden colonists. Here they are. So, I mean, it just got weird. And by the way, they were covered in lice and they did stink. It was awful. I mean, there's all these stories in Western expansion about people packing bear grease because they would trade the native populations for bear grease because it cut down on the lice. And the natives didn't have a lot of lice. The lice came from the rats and these other gross city inhabiting rodents that hopped onto the white people, and then white people just had them and scratched and itched. And, we were disgusting in Western expansion. And I don't think there's enough history really touching on how disgusting we were. And when we were expanding as these stinky, nasty, pitted out, crotched out weirdos, itching our heads and our crotches and our butt cracks, going across the prairie and encountering these very clean native people who had a regular regimen of natural deodorants and natural bathing. And you got to keep in mind, too, we were coming from a Western expansion culture that believed that bathing in water would make you sick. That was what the plague doctors back in frickin' God in Europe told everybody, that if they actually got on board with water and bathed, it would make you sick. And yes, there is a lot of bacteria in water and et cetera and so on, but they weren't really understanding how this all worked. So nobody bathed because they were afraid they were going to get the plague. And that kind of came over to the colonies. And then, of course, the colonies were kind of out back to begin with. And then you've got settlers cutting across really dry, arid regions. They tried to stay by water, but they couldn't always. So there was a lot of gross body odor and stench and disgust and starvation. And, when people start to starve, they start to smell funny. You've all of these chemicals in the body that go off. So I'm just painting a picture for you for how nasty most of these Western expansion settlers were when they actually encountered the native populations who were clean and were thinking, what the hell are with these weird vermin people that don't know how to survive out here? They stink to high hell. There are Plains native stories talking about being able to smell the cavalry coming miles before they got there because the wind was blowing in the right direction. And it was just this musky, butt crack body odor showdown that these native folks were like, wow, okay, the licey whiteys are coming. Let's just move on down the road here. So, I mean, we don't talk about real history. We don't talk about why cultures got along or clashed or did or didn't. And our beautiful native populations, when we first arrived here on Plymouth Rock, were trying to help us. They were trying to help us with, body cleaning issues. And the pilgrims at that time thought that the natives were trying to kill them by suggesting they get into hot springs and get into the water. I mean, they thought they were trying to wipe them out. And at first, the natives couldn't even be around them. And the native women were trying to help the other women with the salves and leaves and anything they else could do to help with infection. And I mean, we literally were insane people coming over here from what was then the first world that encountered the ancient world. And the ancient world in 1610, 1620 knew what the hell it was doing. And the first world was coming out of the model, of the very first crumbs of the model of sociopathic domination through restricting resources, education, and money. Okay? So just think about that a minute. That's what our country was founded on. And we just don't know why we have so many problems in the United States of America. America! So as I get into this podcast, I wanted to paint a picture for you of the clash of cultures that took place in the then what was considered the first world and the indigenous world. And it doesn't matter whether it was the indigenous world in the United States or it was the indigenous world in Ireland or it was the indigenous world in a number of places, because what I was having an opportunity to see here is that this clash of ego, authoritarianism, and really hubris that came in with the European way of looking at things. And it comes from rulers and it comes from all kinds of things. As they went out and smashed the tribes of surrounding nations, this shaped a world. Okay. And so this was England going out and Rome going out, even though Rome believed in the old gods and they borrowed them from the Greek gods and they changed their names, but they were the same deal. So this goes back a ways But it really started with the Christianization of Europe and the extension of power through what I like to call the bastardization of Christianity through Europe back in the day. And so you had the English moving up and smashing tribal cultures and clan cultures in the Celtic countries, in Ireland and in Scotland. And you had the Normans going up and trying to crush the tribal cultures that are what we call now the Vikings. And they didn't fare so well up there. The Vikings kind of kicked their butts and handed their instruments back to them and said, in their very, they weren't Norway, they're Denmark, but just consider the whole region. So I'll say this just tongue in cheek. Consider that Norwegian temperament that's just sort of chill until it's not, right? So there's an absolute butt-kicking explosion of pure, vile bloodshed. And then it's back to like, hey, you want an ale? Sweet boat you got there. See you later, man. Bye. That was kind of the Vikings. So it was really strange. It was a strange time. So the reason I bring all this up in this little mini history lesson is because it's important. We've got to go back the way that we came to understand who we are and why we are where we're at. So that leads me into the main topic of our podcast, which is the gods of the old world. Myths or actual beings, okay? Myths, monsters, or actual beings. And the fact of the matter is, when we look at the pervasive stories that were passed around multiple cultures in the world, okay? It wasn't just one or two. You've got to start to look at the fact that human beings didn't have Facebook. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have television. They didn't have YouTube. We could not communicate this idea of giant, powerful, polytheistic beings that ranged between, 6 and 12 of them, like a council, all over the whole world. That's going to really defy communication at that time, especially considering some of these cultures just didn't hardly touch one another for thousands of years. And eventually they did, as we got better with travel and being able to store water and being able to figure out the pack animals can get us places and haul our crap. Eventually we moved on. But the reason I bring this up is because sometimes the most obvious answer is the answer. It's the Occam's razor issue. And when we look at histories, and I say world tribal histories, in the United States of America, tribal history refers to the Native American populations. Tribal histories in the Celtic regions refer to Celtic tribes, and which then later became Celtic clans, okay? So, and then you look at the Norwegian tribes, which later then became family groups or governments, which later became countries. So the tribal aspect, and let's not even, we're leaving out Australia. I'm sorry, sadness. I'm sorry. So down in Australia, we've got all the tribes, and we've got all of the amazing Aboriginal tribes down there that encountered all of these weird Western culture prisoners, talk about stinking up the place, on these boats. And the Aboriginals were like, oh my, what is the deal? Where are all these wretched, stinking, pale people coming from? And why are they all so afraid? And why are they all so grumpy? And why are they all so undereducated and underfed? And God, they smell. I mean, seriously. Because you have to also consider that the native tribes were, a lot of them genetically just didn't have a lot of body hair. And body hair traps odor. And here came these hairy, from the north, these hairy Western Europeans that were just covered in hair and covered in fungus and stinking up a storm. And so it was just, can you imagine? I'm so glad I wasn't there. Or maybe that's why I blocked out that lifetime, because that would suck. I can't deal. Ugh. So anyway, going back to the old gods, right? For the longest time, the old gods, and they still to this day, are thought of as myths. Well, I got into a fascinating discussion with my daughter, and my daughter was just absolutely fascinating in that she loves to watch shows about the Greek gods. And I mean, who doesn't like the Greek gods, And then you look at these book series for kids that fly off the handle. There's Percy Jackson, and I mean, there's all of the Greek myths that they've retooled into movies. And I began to talk to her about why she thought this was fascinating. And she said, well, I think the gods were real. I was so proud of my daughter. She says, I think they're real, and I think we just don't understand what they were. And of course, who doesn't want to be the descendant of a god, right? And of course, a demigod, if you follow the Greek line of mythology, is a half human, half god. And they were, they were usually heroes, and they had extraordinary powers. Now, this isn't the first time we hear about human hybridization, because you can look in a more conservative format and look in the Old Testament, of the Bible, which was originally the Torah. And just always remember that Christianity wholeheartedly ripped off all the books of Judaism and then kind of amended it and put all this new stuff on top of it. And then started tweaking the old words of the Torah, which I have spoken to a lot of my Jewish friends, hardcore Jewish friends, who really aren't super duper happy that Christianity has taken over their words that they fought to preserve so hard, to be so accurate to the scrolls and the texts and the meanings. I mean, the words themselves were sacred. And then all these, Christian hippies take it over and they do a million different translations of it and call it the Old Testament, And I can understand how culturally, talk about cultural appropriation. Wow, Christianity, hello. How about our Jewish brothers and sisters whose entire religion we just sort of took off with and then took their most sacred text and then ran it through a million different translations and political needs and all this other crap. I mean, nobody talks about that appropriation, but I will. Because I'm already such a fan favorite with the hardcore Christian evangelical community in America. I mean, why not just really deepen my roots of love, from them to me? I'm just saying. So when we look at the Old Testament and we're looking at human hybridization, when you study the flood with Noah, you study a time frame where the Old Testament talks about giants roaming the earth. And they were the children, the offspring of fallen angels, of these beings, these bright, powerful beings that came from the sky, and mankind. And according to the Bible, they found the daughters of men to be enticing. And so they would get busy with them, and all of these beings would be born that were half human and half fallen angel. Okay, now this is according to the Old Testament in the Bible. And they referred to these beings as the Nephilim. And the Nephilim were mean as hell. Mean as hell. They were nasty beings. They would torture human beings just because they could. A man, and they were big, they were tall, they were strong, they were 7, 8, and 9, and 10 feet tall. And I just think of these poor women busted in half, giving birth to these hybrid babies, my God. However, hopefully maybe they hit a growth spurt at 15, we don't know. However, these beings are recorded in Jewish tribal history, which we just covered. Those words in that history was sacred, okay? It was sacred. So the embellishment opportunity there, the need to embellish for political gain, the need to embellish for power, the Jewish culture had and still has, a very different relationship with their words and their writings than does the rest of Western culture, which will write anything and make it fake news and use it for political gain. Now, there were sects of Jewish leaders back in the day who got really political, like the Pharisees, the Sanhedrin, all of those guys. But overall, the words meant something different to them culturally. Okay, so let's go back to the Nephilim. So here we have a tribal culture of people who are recording events and keeping those events sacred as a measure of their spiritual integrity. Okay, because that's the basis of keeping these. According to my Jewish friends, this is what they tell me. So there's this counting of human, angel, hybrid beings called Nephilim that are huge and mean. And they had extraordinary powers according to the Old Testament in the Bible or the Torah. They had extraordinary powers. And because they had extraordinary powers, they would subjugate regular human beings and dominate them. And they would make them worship them as gods. And they would play with human beings like pawns. And they knew they were something different. And they saw humans as just this knuckle dragon species of whatever. Okay? Now, right about this time, if you keep reading your Bible, because I'm sure you've got nothing better to do on a Saturday night, it's either that or binge watch Good Girls. So the choice is yours. Okay? So if you're still reading the Bible, you come up to the part in the Bible that talks all about, which I think is interesting, the flood. And one of the reasons why the flood came and why God said, we got to clean this crap up here, was that the Nephilim were running all over the earth, effing with people to a massive degree and forcing them to worship them. So in the Bible, God says, well, this isn't cool. You guys are weirdo hybrids and you're beating up on the indigenous population, and this isn't okay. So I'll tell you what we're going to do. You're all stuck in semi-mortal bodies. And the thing that semi-mortal bodies really have a hard time with is breathing underwater. Still, sorry. Aquaman isn't here yet, gang, so let's just go here. Now, considering that on the planet during this time frame, and we're talking thousands of years ago, some of these books in the Old Testament are now coming up on, 8,000 years old. I mean, they're old. And so we are also finding other texts, Sumerian texts, the cuneiform texts that talk about a race of giants with superhero powers that were so cruel that people hid from them. And they were awful. So speeding up to the flood. The flood! Pretty much God thought that sucked, according to the Bible. And so there was a great big flood. And it flooded everything and killed off a lot of these Nephilim. Now, it didn't say it killed them all. It just said it killed all of God's creation except for what was on the ark with Noah. All right? So consider this just a minute. Okay, we're gonna put a pin in that story or that historical account, depending on how you look at things. Now we're going to take the pin out of all the Greek gods who were running along the same time frame as all of these stories historically. And the Greeks are writing at that same several thousand years ago about 12 of these asshats who are superhuman, and they live on top of a mountain called Olympus. And they're mean as hell to people, and they play with people like they're articles on a chessboard. And this is the identical description of the Nephilim in the Old Testament. Okay? And I mean, we all know, quite honestly, probably more about the nasty temperament of the Greek gods and the fickle nature of the Greek gods than of the temperament of the Nephilim. And if you read the Old Testament, especially versions that haven't been like converted to the, hey, hippie, everybody needs to water down the words in the Bible versions of the Bible, you're going to see the Old English. Or if you get an Aramaic Bible or a Hebrew Bible that's been translated directly, that's really what you want to read because that's where the good stuff is. That's before the American politicization of the Bible took over. So you want to read the words that are the words in there. And it talks about how the Nephilim had children and the children would war with each other. And certain other Nephilim would kill other Nephilim's kids to maintain their brand or their power. And in the Greek gods, if you read about the Greek, there was Zeus always getting mad that somebody had a better son with somebody else and they'd curse that kid or whatever. So we're looking at identical sets of behavior from two different cultures. Now, granted, if you want to look at where Greece is and you want to look at where the Middle East is, all you got to do in the Middle East is go north, hit the north coast of Africa, get in a boat, go across, and you're going to hit the Greek Isles. So it's not inconceivable that they could have shared some of these mythologies. It's also not inconceivable that the same group that was killing so many people in the Middle East, when the flood happened, somehow some of them made their way up to Greece. Or maybe they were frequenting the whole area because they were freaks with superpowers. Who even knows what they were doing? But I do think it's phenomenal that if you look at the same time frame, thousands of years ago, we had all of these Norse gods hanging out in Valhalla and coming down to the earth and dealing with human beings. And the funny thing is, we all know Thor, right? Thanks to the Marvel movies. And Thor's hammer threw lightning, right? Zeus's spear threw lightning. You read about the Nephilim who drug the lightning down from heaven to cast it upon the earth in the Middle East. You see what I'm laying down here? So we've got this documentation of these weird-ass hybrid jerks running around, and really the Norse gods weren't quite as bad. They weren't quite as bad as the recounts of the Nephilim. They weren't quite as bad as the recounts of the Greek gods, but they could, you had to kill people and do blood sacrifices to the Norse gods. And maybe they were more chill because maybe that culture of beings up there, that tribal culture was like, hey, whatever, you want us to gut sister over here? Hey, sister, you up for that? Oh, do you have any ale? Okay, I'll go to Valhalla. Cool, whatever. Keep the peace. Gut me. I don't know. I mean, it was considered a gift to be given to the gods in the Nordic tribes. Whereas giving a gift to God, not talking the Nephilim, but the Nephilim used to command. They wanted human sacrifices. They wanted to see what the people would give them. And again, get a hold of an original translation of the actual Hebrew to actually read about what the Nephilim were like, because they really kind of got watered out in the more current Bibles. And the reason they got more watered out that I came to see was because it would indicate that there were beings with superpowers genetically that were on the earth. And what if somebody rose to power and claimed to be a descendant of one of those beings? You see where I'm laying down here? It's kind of like the reason that we talk about Jesus having no children, because, oh my God, what would happen if, some wackadoodle claimed to be the descendant of Jesus? Or maybe that person isn't a wackadoodle. Maybe they're fabulous and they can genetically show that they were a descendant of Jesus. What does that do to the Pope? What does that do to the world religious groups that took over the planet in the name of God, in the name of intercessing for the being that rules the universe? Well, it's going to kick your ass right out, isn't it? Because who's going to listen to that guy in all those robes as opposed to this guy who's a descendant of Jesus? I raise my hand for the descendant of Jesus, right? So, I mean, when we look back historically, and this is totally another podcast, but we look back historically and we see all kinds of other cultural nods to the fact that Christ did have children. Christ was partnered with what we know as Mary Magdalene, or, the church made her into a hooker. She was actually a business person who just kind of ranged in the services she provided, but they really turned her into this crazed being. And once she kind of cleaned up a bit, she got involved with the mission. It was really a movement, the movement that Jesus brought in. And so there's a lot more documentation coming forward that the church has silenced over the years, talking about the fact that they kind of got the hell out of Dodge as Rome decided that they might be a threat, and really the political leaders of their area, which were the religious leaders that were Jewish at the time. It was just a bad combo of everybody grabbing for power. Jesus and his followers and his family was like, this is stupid, man. Let's go to places where people are more kind. So they kind of took off out of there. And so, again, our new Christian Bibles erase lineage because it could take power away from those who have the power. And so when you look at this whole layout, gang, all right, if you're looking at the entire layout as it is, what we've got here is we've got a group of beings that, if you want to call them Nephilim or Greek gods or Norse gods, all exacted similar behavior. And, the Loki, the trickster, you've got all the Greek gods and the Apollo who used to pull the wool over people's eyes just to F with them, I mean, you've got these similar characteristics of beings, and really the Jewish account or the Old Testament account or the Torah account doesn't get as far into the individual personalities of the Nephilim because the desert tribes were afraid of them. They were trying not to engage them. They were trying to stay out of the way of them because they would enslave them and subjugate them. So then let's kind of step forward to the Greek. We went to the Greek, we went to the Norse. Let's step over to the gods of Egypt. And what did I just mention? The desert-dwelling tribes, the tribes that later became Israel, they were trying to stay out of the sightline of the Nephilim because the Nephilim were rounding them up and enslaving them to build their cities, to build their structures. Well, who did that? Who liked to enslave the Jews back in the day? Well, Egypt did. And Egypt had these megalithic structures, these huge structures. And they had these beings, Ra, the sun god, and Set, and all these different beings that came down, Osiris, that were these gods. And it was, again, a group of them. It wasn't just one. It was a group. Ra was the sun god. Ra was the head. And from Ra, all things came, right? But then you get this chance to look at this diversified group, who again, some of them wielded the sunlight and the energy from the sky. I mean, we're picking up on a theme here. So the interesting thing about this group of hybrid beings, especially when we focus on the culture in Egypt, is that the Egyptian culture was highly literal. If you look at Egyptian hieroglyphics, they are exceptionally literal. A falcon doesn't look like a crow. It doesn't look like a dove. It doesn't look like a rabbit. It looks just like a falcon. You can look at that thing and say, wow, that's a falcon. A wine cup with a stem doesn't look like a glass or a drop of water. It looks extremely like a chalice. So the Egyptians were, by their nature, a very literal culture. So then you go on to the Egyptian hieroglyphs and the Egyptian tomb walls, where carved and painted were the gods. And the gods were huge. And you look at these, again, a group of Egyptian gods where they were sitting, like 20 feet tall, 18 feet tall, and they were sitting little human beings on their lap. And the little human beings looked like little kids. And in the 1800s, when England sent the Egyptologists in to excavate these incredible treasures, Tutankhamun and so many more, when they saw these photos in stone, these paintings in stone, when they saw this historic account of hieroglyphs and artwork that created the Egyptian gods to be so much larger than the population with the little bitty population on their knee, they immediately applied, and this is what I was talking about, to that white Western arrogance that came in the Gilded Age that had to be hyper. It was all very sensible. There's a reasonable explanation for this. The old Egyptologists dismissed these very literal drawings of giant beings with little bitty people sitting on their lap as a grandiose gesture from the kings. They made it a grand gesture that the kings were trying to make themselves appear greater than their population. Yet what they failed to take into consideration is that the Egyptian culture it was so literal. It wasn't grandizing anything. It was reproducing what it saw. Nothing else in its written and especially its written culture or its art culture represented beings that weren't what they saw. I mean, the papyrus reeds were perfect in their reproduction of what they look like. So why the heck they would just take off in an interpretive moment with the ego of a ruler, but oh no, everything else is super literal. See, again, we're dealing with that is a westernized way of looking at that culture. And of course, by God, there's no such thing as gods with alligator heads or gods with jackal heads. There's no such thing as that, and human bodies, because We in Western culture, we've never seen that. And of course, it's just fanciful makings of a very primitive people attempting to make sense out of the mystery of the science around them. And of course, back in the early 1800s, we had our head up our butt with science. We really didn't know what we were doing, but boy, did we thought we did. So the ironic part there is if we go from the Egyptian gods and we go back to the Nephilim. The Nephilim are described as some of them being so terrifying as being half human and half beast. They are described as being monsters, sometimes with multiple heads or arms. So let's go down. We're going to put a pin right there in Egypt for a minute, and we're going to move all down to the Hindu culture. Now, the Hindu culture, that's 10,000 gods to represent the one God, the collective one God, broken into 10,000 different aspects of that one God. Because to worship just one God, our brains wouldn't be able to get around it. So the Hindu culture breaks it down to many gods. And even the mini gods had demigods. And they were multiple armed. And sometimes they had an elephant head. And, whatever. And the Hindu gods, overall, there were some that were unkind and would hand you your butt. But overall, the Hindu gods were working on behalf of humanity. And they had their destroyers. And they had their mother figures. However, their culture dealt with life and death differently, also believing you had another shot at it. Reincarnation. That you weren't just here once. And there was a different weight that human life carried and still does in a lot of the Hindu cultures, as opposed to the value of a life of an insect. All life is valuable in that culture. So it wasn't put in a place of dominion like, you read the Christian Bible and boy, God puts man in charge of everything according to Genesis. Well, actually, if you break that down to the actual Hebrew, God made man the zookeeper. They made man the poop shoveler. They made humankind the stewards, the keepers of the garden. That's really what that Hebrew breaks down to. It is not dominion over. It was stewardship of. And because the hybridization of human beings that we actually call the creation story, that's another story, that's another podcast, on the earth created an instantly more aware species. Then we have, the tree of life and the snake and the evil and the temptations and the consciousness breakdowns and trying to describe a consciousness breakdown between a being that chooses something dark over choosing something light. That just gets a little dicey. So that got created into more of a story about how does this work. However, that's an entire podcast all in and of itself. But if we're going to the, quote, mythologies of these gods, we see them reproduced all over the dang world. There were Sumerian gods that had the head of a dragon or head of a snake or head of a monster or head of a reptile. Just like the gods in Egypt that had the head of the alligator. Just like the gods down in the Hindu countries that have the reptile head. I mean, this gets all over the place. And then you go to the Greek gods, which could turn into monsters and turn into anything they wanted. And you get Medusa, who had a head of snakes and could turn people to stone. What's the deal with the repeating reptile head here? And so again, at some point, if you're a thinking, reasoning human being, we've got to dismiss the ego of, well, this culture must be trying to make things up in order to really understand their environment. How about they're just freaking observing their environment and writing it down? So back to my daughter, who loves to watch Greek god movies because she says, I think they're real. And I asked her, why do you think they're real? Okay, so we're kind of going back to the top of the podcast. And she says to me, well, I think they're real because there's just too much detail. I mean, there's so much detail in these gods and who they warred with and who they had kids with. And she's like, it's like their whole history is kept and written. And that just seems weird. If they're gods, why would we care so much? Like, why wouldn't they just be like Zeus, the god of this or whatever? And the Western world, when it expanded into all of these multi-god cultures applied the Western world's lens over everything and said, well, they're just making it stories, silly stories to make sense of creation, of course. And maybe that's true to a degree. I mean, people learn through allegory. However, come on. I mean, at what point can we step back and just look at this and say, my God, there are way too many overlapping weird issues here. All right. Now, a person could argue, well, somebody from the Middle East rowed a boat over to Greece and taught them all. This one person taught a whole culture about crazy gods that do crazy things. And then one of those people got in a boat and rowed all the way outside of the Mediterranean, all the way up to the coast and went up to the Nordic countries and told them a story. And then they took it over. And everybody, of course, listened to this weirdo from another place who doesn't even speak their language, of course. And then they adopted their religion, because isn't that how Christianity spread? Do you see what we do? Christianity didn't spread by people telling one story of a guy who could do magic things. It spread because kings, claiming the power of the one guy who could do magic things, set their armies in to kill everybody who didn't agree with them. That's how Christianity spread. Originally, the followers of Christ were taught to do mystical and amazing things and were set out into the populations to teach people how to be miracle wielders. I mean, honestly, the Course of Miracles, that was Jesus' original template, right? To teach people to be miracle machines. And we have had many teachers through the times trying to teach people to align with that miracle power within them. Many, many teachers. We don't always talk about that, though. But see, if I am the church and I want all the power, and some dude, some hippie, sandal-wearing, robe-wearing, junk-swinging dude is just wandering through the desert, teaching people how to do miracles, then I can't oppress those people anymore, because they just see me as the muggle who's insecure. Plus, they're, making their own water into wine, so they don't need my money. So I better shut that dude down, wandering about in his full-length body kilt. I mean, really, do you see where this is going? I mean, this is literally what we had happening back in the day. And so when I observe these cultures and I observe the energies written behind the Greek gods, the Nephilim, the Nordic gods, the Hindu gods, the Sumerian gods, I get a chance to see such a similar vibration. It is insane. It is insane. And so if you also take into consideration that there were a lot of these little demigods running around that were the kids of the Nephilim. And they were mean too. So they're like a quarter breed. The Nephilim's a half breed. And you've got these beings, supernatural beings that bred with humanity. Now, what the hell were these supernatural beings? What were they? In Egypt's culture, I do believe there were Nephilim type, or gods who bred with people to create pharaohs or to create the sons of the gods or daughters of the gods. I also have noted that in the serious study of Egypt, that the people who they represent as these great big beings that were the gods, it's very likely that those beings came directly from the Sirius AB star system. Seriously. Here till Thursday. And actually were these beings who came in and bred with humans. I mean, they were aliens, for a lack of a better way to put it, that came down and really were digging what Egypt had to offer at this time. And why would they do that? Why would beings from another place come and do that? Well, if you think about Egypt at the time, it wasn't this big sandy pit of nothing. Egypt was super fertile. It was a different climate on the earth. And the Nile kind of wrapped around where the pyramids of Giza are at and all these incredible temples. It was fertile and almost like a tropical environment, quite honestly. So there was water everywhere. There was, all this fertile crops. Wheat grew all over the place, or an ancient version of wheat. So Egypt at the time had a lot of electromagnetic properties going for it that could power things like pyramids. And pyramids were power generators. But again, That's another podcast. So when you have these gods or these beings coming down, the earth at that time, the ancient earth, was being utilized as kind of a jump base for many different off-world cultures. We see evidence of these off-world cultures and these off-world gods also in the Aztec and the Mayan depictions of the gods that came from the sky. And they look humanoid, but they look very different than the humans. They have, weird slopey foreheads and very elongated heads in the back and very thick lips and big noses and big brow lines. So they look like us, but they look like a very hybridized version of us. And so that's why, again, when you go to South America and you look at the different types of sky gods that they talked about, those beings, those sky gods that came down, the human beings wanted to emulate the look of the sky gods, as was the case in Egypt. So you've got people in Egypt and people in South America, both worshiping these types of sky gods that if you look at the way the heads of the ancient Egyptians looked in the hieroglyphs and in the paintings and the drawings, they had these big, tall, elongated heads that were huge. And they have found skulls going back to South America that have red hair on them, which is really interesting, that are these great big elongated heads. And the way that the skulls break down, the optical nerve is different, the jaw placement is different. They look humanish, but they are very different with these big, tall heads. Now, the indigenous populations in South America and in Egypt began to bind the heads of their children to try to flatten their foreheads and try to elongate the back of their heads. But even, to try to get these babies' skulls to shape up differently. But even in doing that, they still couldn't get the skull height that was seen on these alien beings, basically. So there are the Nazca skulls, Nazca. You should totally Google this. It's so interesting. And they're down in South America. And again, they are different than human skulls that can be bound. You can completely see they have a different makeup. And they literally look like the cone heads on Saturday Night Live. It's hilarious. Just these big, tall heads. So we see a similar sky god culture. We see similar types of pyramids in Egypt and in South America. Those are separated by vast distances of water, okay? So it's probably unlikely that one little evangelical person who's going around to all these different places and spreading the news of the multicultural polygod society got in a boat and paddled over to the Caribbean and told all the South American people in their ministry of spreading the good news about all these gods that the gods came from the sky. I think they just probably encountered the same Syrians over there in South America that they did in Egypt. And so, there's a very fascinating sky god issue going on. At the same time that there are the Nephilim running all over the place. So I think we have an intersection of these beings that are going all over the world. So let's go back to the flood. Let's go back to Noah. We're rewinding. So here's the Nephilim. We're in the Middle East. They're subjugating people and raping people and creating hybrid beasts that are just frightening, which is also documented if you read the Bible. And God says, enough's enough. We're out of balance. This is getting weird. And there is a flood. Well, the interesting thing about the Bible flood is that the flood is documented in many, many different world cultures. And what modern scientists theorize is that as the earth was cooling in its formative years, 10,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago, it came to a place where the earth was surrounded in kind of a mist, like the whole earth was sort of tropical, which kind of makes a little bit of sense because as we look at the dinosaur era, the world was a swampy mess back then. It was all steaming swamps and big deciduous leaf plants. So it's not that far of a stretch to consider that the world, because of that steaming environment, created an atmosphere around itself that was like a greenhouse. Have you ever walked into a greenhouse? It's got that mist in the air and it's kind of a really dense humidity. So what we can look at here is the fact that the earth, and this is what science has found in analyzing different layers of stone, different types of plants they find, different types of soil levels, that the earth used to have a ton of moisture in the air just hanging there. Now, as we know about condensation in the air, right? As condensation cools, what happens to it? It gets heavy and it becomes rain. So modern science theorizes, because there is this massive flood story all over the world, this flood story is shared. Modern science theorizes that the Earth got to a place of natural cooling in its evolution, that it tipped the balance of this giant mat of mist that was probably several miles, 10s and 20 miles thick, 30, 40, 50 miles thick, all around the Earth, that created this greenhouse effect, like a giant mist, haze. Think of like a chronic haze. Rather than super congealed clouds, which would happen once in a while, think above that a giant haze, okay, of mist. And they theorize that the Earth cooled down so much that mist compressed and fell to the Earth. It became the most epic deluge ever. And the epic deluge, of course, flooded everything, because all the rivers were flooding. All of the oceans were rising. The whole thing blew out. And during this deluge, historians who are in the area of the Mediterranean look at the Minoan society. And many people think of Minoa as the original Atlantis, which Atlantis, I've done a podcast on Atlantis, but Atlantis wasn't exactly a floating island. It was more like a craft. But again, that's another podcast. They theorize, these modern geologists and geophysicists talk about the fact that the Mediterranean Sea likely had a very, very narrow inlet that let the seawater in, and the Mediterranean Sea was more temperate because it had a natural seawall with a narrow little gate that could be gone through. Like maybe the gate was only a mile wide or a half a mile wide that connected it out to the rest of the Atlantic or wherever it goes, okay? But the Mediterranean was more of a protected inlet bay, if anything else, than a sea. Well, it theorizes that when this big burst of humidity came down onto the Earth and the sea levels rose and the freshwater levels rose, it put a lot of pressure on that little land barrier that was between, say, the little gate between the Mediterranean and the rest of the massive ocean out there. And that broke away or eroded. And that was flooded with water. And when that happened, you read about Minoa, and the Minoan civilization talks about the demise of it was this massive tidal wave that came in and just ruined everything. This epic, epic tidal wave that came in and sunk everything. And the Minoan civilization, it had like a little island, but there were, think about floating barges in a way. There were these floating rings that they created outside of the island that basically people just lived on these floating rings. It was a very advanced society, and obviously they got a little bit of help from some of our off-world pals in engineering that. Yet they were very advanced, the Minoans. And then here comes what's going to wreck a fleet of houseboats, a giant tidal wave, okay? So there goes Minoa. And, of course, they theorize that could have been a volcano that erupted or blah, blah, blah. But they're also, meaning the science community, talk about when all of that water hit the Earth in a cooling and started dropping all this cold water where it was formerly temperate, that caused the upper crust of the Earth to contract. Even the upper crust of it contracted enough that it pulled different faults this or that way. It would open up a different lava channel or magma channel. It would be just enough with the whole world's very top layer contracting that it would move the plates underneath. So then you've got all of this, geological activity happening where the plates are moving and there's little earthquakes here or there. And to the earth, gang, you got to realize an earthquake is like, when you stretch in the morning and your shoulder goes crack and your wrist goes crack, crack. And you're like, oh God, that feels better. That's what earthquakes feel like to the planet Earth. It's just the Earth popping something back into place. It's stretching something here and there. So going back to the idea that these were real beings instead of fictional beings, talking about all of these gods, Greek, Roman, Egyptian, the gods of the Norse communities, the gods of Sumeria, the gods down in South America, the unbelievable coinkydinks between all of these gods, the Nephilim of the Jewish count of these hybrid beings, fallen angels they were called. Were they fallen angels? Were they demons that came to earth? Were they angels? Maybe some of them. Were they ETs? Ezekiel saw a wheel way in the middle of the air, a wheel within a wheel. And the beings that walked with the wheel were monstrous looking and frightening looking. The angels that walked with the wheel, were they angels? Were they aliens? What the hell were they? Well, I've been asking around with some of my angelic friends, and it turns out that some of them were angels and some of them were aliens, but a lot of them, at least the ones that created the Nephilim and the Greek gods and the Norse gods, they refer to them as those who chose differently. They were angels that fell. I guess that had a little itch they had to scratch with the daughters of man. Who knows what was going on there? But they could take on a corporeal form. They could take on these forms. They could take over men. They could take over humans. And that was obviously a no-no, but they did it anyway. I mean, these are highly powerful beings that for some reason were able to tweak physics back in the day and make this happen. So the angels refer to them as actual fallen angels or angels who chose differently. And I think that's probably why the being, whether you want to call it Ra or God or the lucky rabbit's foot surfing the sky, was like, hey, man, come on with the indigenous population down here. If I were Star Trek, I would say you are violating the prime directive, okay? Don't be doing that. Come on. And then, of course, if we look at science, that corresponds with the time frame where the earth lets go and everything drowns. Or does everything drown? Are some of these beings advanced enough to get the hell up top, the highest mountain they can and live? Like on Olympus? Like the Greek gods that ascended? Are they advanced enough to bend space-time and create dimensional places to go to? Like Valhalla? Really, when we look at the whole earth and how these gods were huge and now, the argument I'll hear against this in my mind with people is, well, if these beings were real, then how come they're not around anymore? Well, maybe they weren't immortal. Maybe because they did breed with other beings that were human, maybe they had an expiration date. Maybe they depended upon the energy or worship of others. There's lore all over the world, whether it's Egyptian, the Egyptian lore, not as much, but you see it in the Greek gods, of course, the Roman gods. Rome was so damn lazy. They just ripped off whatever anybody else did and stamped a Rome stamp on it and said, hey, Rome made this. Seriously. And then they came up with some cool architectural ideas and some great ways to plant symmetrical and asymmetrical trees. Yet, Egypt wasn't really as big on the idea of the gods punishing people as much as the gods saying, fall in line or we'll kill you. But they weren't really playing with people as much. They were trying to accomplish building something, which quite honestly is in line with the South American gods who came from the sky, who really weren't playing with people as much. I mean, they wanted to have human sacrifice and all these things, and they were subjugating people, but they weren't using them to play with as toys, which was more of a Nephilim thing, which would make sense because if you look at the characters of angels in the Bible, angels don't really understand humans all that much. They really don't. Even when I work with them day to day, humans don't really get people. They don't get us. They kind of do, and they think we're really cool in their own weird little way, but they're so different. It's like us trying to understand a jellyfish and a jellyfish trying to understand us. Somehow it works out with the angelic realm. Yeah, we're so different. So it would make sense that the Nephilim would play with people because they'd be half mammal that is territorial and mean, and half this thing that doesn't know how to make anything out of anything, right? So, just in summary of this, I would tell you that when we are looking at these gods, conferring with the angelic realm, they were real beings. Now, later on, some of these beings probably got co-opted and probably got fan-fictioned and all these things. But especially the Greek gods, those were these beings, these Nephilim-like beings that advanced up, got the hell out of Dodge, tried to stay alive, and began to create this realm together. And again, as people went away from fearing the wrath of the gods, then there is also a portion of all this mythology talking about these beings not having purpose anymore or having power. Like, it's no fun to play with your food if your food dies, right? So after a while, maybe they just all died off. Maybe they just went somewhere else. Maybe nobody was afraid of them anymore. Or maybe they just didn't care if they killed them because they believed that the one true God that took over the Christianity was greater. Whatever you want to call it. I haven't actually asked the angelic realm where the hell these guys went. They indicated that they were part human. And so my guess is they could live for a while and then eventually you're going to die, or go to a different dimension or go somewhere else. But eventually you're going to run into your mortality. So my hope today in this podcast is that you can really put together the obvious connections, the Occam's razor. Sometimes the most obvious answer is the answer. That you can put together the most obvious answer of how this has all evolved as one moving forward, quote, mythology, that these beings were real. And what do we learn from these beings? Well, we learn that we demonized a lot of these beings and we godized a lot of these beings. And so when we look at the propensity that we have to make gods out of beings who are moving forward and trying to become something greater than ourselves, we can make a god out of a half angel, half human who can do mystical things, or we can subscribe to, say, teachings from Lord Krishna or from Jesus the Christ or other spiritual teachers who came and said, you too can manipulate energies to become incredible in manifesting miracles, and you don't need to put on a pedestal this magic creature that's a half this and a half that, who's really cruel and mean to you. You can manifest your own Jedi Knight powers and cast that being into the darkness and not even be affected by it. So I do believe, too, there was a consciousness shift between the gods of the old world and the humans of the world that was trying to evolve. And that's a whole nother podcast about how we went from being subjugated by powerful beings to being taught that we were miracle machines. We were the superheroes. We were the Iron Man. We could fly in our own ways. And we didn't need to be subjugated by these particular, whether they were off-world hybrids, off-worlders themselves, angel-human hybrids, the gods that showed us mystical and magical things. Why not? Just, pick up on some teachers who are like, hey, guess what? You can do water into wine too, and you don't need those jackholes. So, hey, woo! And this is obviously not a solicit for Hinduism or Christianity. It's showing how these beings were real all over the world. Maybe they're still around to some capacity. I thoroughly believe that there are human beings on this planet that are walking around with some of this DNA in them. I thoroughly believe there are human beings on this planet that are walking around with Jesus' DNA. I thoroughly believe there are people that are walking this planet, walking around with elemental and human DNA. Because you have to remember that there are really only 4 building blocks to all of the cosmic DNA. And down here on Earth, there are special inconsistencies in terms of reproduction. Yet what we're also looking at here is the ability for combinations in nature. Okay, so let's just look at God or Ra, or the happy rabbit's foot in the sky. It would stand to reason that all of its creation on some level, even though some special jumps don't really work out, there are some special jumps that do. Donkeys and horses can have a baby, and that's a mule. So there are certain special jumps that happen. And I can feel in people that wiggle of elemental DNA, of off-worlder DNA. Pretty much all white people have some kind of off-world DNA whacking around. I mean, we are the colonizers, white people. Sorry. So we've been colonized. We were the hybrids. We went out there and, we don't think we are, but, So, it just gets nuts when you really, really get into the history of the earth, the gods, the old gods, the mythologies. It's not to say that there were not mythological allegories created on the basis of these beings for teaching tools. I'm sure that's true, and I'm sure that's true in the Christian Bible. However, speaking in terms of looking at something just plainly, the case for the gods being real is massive. And of course, I just asked the angels, and they were like, well, yeah, they were a thing. So I'm okay with that answer, yet I'm also an analytical person. So I hope this has really inspired you to think outside the box, to think about your own incredible capabilities. Maybe you have some of this mystical DNA in you. Maybe we all do to a degree at this point. Maybe that's why there's 8 billion of us surviving on this planet, because we're going to come together with ignited, amazing superhero DNA and raise the vibration on this planet and change everything. Not because we have to be a god, but maybe we are an extension of the greatest form of creation, or God or gods. And because of that, we are ultimate creation if we come together. Deep thoughts. All right, you go think about that, and I will see you next podcast.